In the dark heart of the Everglow Cemetery, there was a forgotten tomb that emitted an eerie aura. Its weathered tombstone bore an ancient cursed spell that had been used to seal an evil presence. Every night, the tomb would glow with a ghostly light, attracting the curious, and those who dared to approach would disappear without a trace. The cemetery was known for stories of people who had gotten lost among the graves, becoming victims of the darkness. A young journalist named Alex, obsessed with the story of the forgotten tomb, decided to investigate. His passion for the paranormal had led him to uncover dark legends and seek the true meaning behind every ghost story. Taking advantage of a stormy night's darkness, Alex ventured into the cemetery. Armed with an old lantern, he began his search, curiously drawn to the flickering light of the tomb. As he delved deeper into the mystery, the young journalist began to encounter a trail of supernatural events. Apparitions, strange inscriptions on gravestones, and nightmares haunted him. Alex discovered that the entity bound to the tomb was an ancient witch, condemned to eternal agony. Revealing her dark past and the reason for the curse, Alex found himself increasingly entangled in the sinister plot that linked his destiny to that of the witch. The battle between the journalist and the entity intensified. Every night, Alex found himself facing unimaginable horrors, including the specters of the witch's previous victims imploring him to end their suffering. In a moment of revelation, Alex realized that the curse was tied to his own past. He was a descendant of those who had condemned the witch. As journalist Alex confronted the condemned witch, the cemetery seemed to be swallowed by suffocating darkness. The battle between light and darkness had reached its peak, and malevolent forces were trying with all their might to hold on to their prisoner. As Alex prepared to sacrifice himself to end the curse, the witch let out a piercing scream, and the details of her dark past were revealed. She had been condemned for heinous crimes, but her sentence had not always been just. As the cursed spell began to unravel, the truth became clear. The witch had initially been a victim of a cruel conspiracy, and her vengeance was directed against those who had betrayed her. As the malevolent entity left her body and was sucked back into the darkness from whence it came, the cemetery began to tremble. A series of supernatural explosions illuminated the night, and the forgotten tomb was completely destroyed. In his heroic act, Alex was surrounded by blinding light as the curse dissolved. However, as the cemetery returned to normal, an even more sinister twist revealed that the witch's darkness had not been completely defeated. An invisible shadow had latched onto Alex's soul, binding him to the cemetery and the witch. The young journalist had brought peace to the cemetery, but at a terrible price. As he left the cemetery, he could hear a ghostly laughter in the air, the sound of the witch fading into the darkness, and the cold gaze of one condemned for eternity. In the heart of a cemetery hidden among the hills, there was a particular tomb that held a dark secret, an ancient spell to summon the insatiable shadow. This legend, long considered just a spooky tale, suddenly became reality when a group of young explorers, while examining an ancient grimoire on a stormy night, inadvertently released the shadow from centuries of imprisonment. As days turned into nights, the members of the group began to sense an evil aura permeating the cemetery. Objects began to mysteriously vanish, and the seemingly living shadows stretched menacingly at dusk. The insatiable shadow hungered for souls and would accept no refusal. Terrified, the surviving members of the group desperately sought a way to seal the entity they had accidentally unleashed. They began uncovering disturbing backstory, indicating that the spell had its origins in a dark cult that practiced ancient rituals of sacrifice to appease the shadow. They realized that, to end the nightmare, they had to retrieve a mysterious object hidden centuries ago. In an attempt to permanently seal the insatiable shadow, the group found themselves face to face with an ancient choice: sacrifice. They needed to offer something priceless to stop the hungry entity. One of the group members, with a heavy heart, volunteered for the sacrifice. It was a heart-wrenching decision, but the only way out. The ritual required courage as the shadow tried to prevent its appetite from being denied. As the group members completed the ritual to seal the insatiable shadow, the atmosphere became tense. The cemetery seemed to resonate with dark energy, and the ground vibrated beneath their feet. The entity itself appeared to have understood the intentions of the young explorers and was not giving up easily. As the shadow was imprisoned within the pages of the grimoire, the young people's eyes were filled with terror and determination. But as the ritual reached its climax, the environment transformed. A cold wind began to blow, and the clouds completely obscured the moon. The symbols on the ground began to glow with an eerie light, making the onlookers shudder. And then came the twist. Instead of being completely sealed, the shadow transcended the grimoire's barriers and split into countless dark fragments that spread throughout the cemetery. It had become more powerful than ever. A twisted and malicious laughter echoed in the air as the shadow took control of the tomb shadows, raising them like an army of undead thirsting for revenge. By the time the young explorers realized the disaster they had unleashed, it was too late. The insatiable shadow had regained its power, and the cemetery was engulfed in suffocating darkness. The battle to contain the curse was over, but now the outside world had to face a threat greater than they had ever imagined. As they left the cemetery, tension in the group grew. They had tried to end a nightmare but had inadvertently unleashed an even greater evil. A sinister voice whispered to them in the darkness that their story was far from over, and now they had to face the consequences of their act in a world haunted by shadows. In the heart of a forgotten cemetery, surrounded by fog and eternal darkness, there was a solitary tomb. An ancient curse had made the guardian of that tomb immortal, condemning him to wander among the graves and watch over the cemetery for eternity. His mind had gradually grown cloudy, and his soul was trapped in a dimension of torment and loneliness. As the nights passed slowly, the guardian was forced to witness the world outside the cemetery evolve without ever being a part of it. Over the centuries, the immortal guardian had helplessly witnessed the world's evolution. He'd been told stories of wars and conquests, of changes in society and culture, but he couldn't participate. His loneliness had driven him to madness, and the cemetery that had once been a place of rest had turned into a place of death and desolation. Trees were entwined with spectral roots, and tombstones had become funerary monuments behind which the guardian wandered aimlessly. One day, a young man named William, with a fascination for mystery and an endless curiosity, ventured into the cemetery in search of a lost treasure. As he dug among the tombstones, he came across the tomb of the immortal guardian. Despite the warning signs and local legends, his thirst for adventure drove him to touch the guardian's tombstone, setting him free from his eternal imprisonment. The immortal guardian, now free but still bound to the cemetery, began to chase William through the graveyard as darkness closed in around them. The young man, terrified, tried to survive and figure out how to end the curse. Every night, their destinies became entwined in a struggle between freedom and eternal damnation. But the guardian was determined to prevent William from escaping and reclaiming what had been taken from him. The immortal guardian relentlessly pursued William through the cemetery with furious aggression. The atmosphere was tense, and the guardian seemed more desperate than ever. Shadows stretched menacingly, and tombstones seemed to whisper the guardian's secrets as he tried to grasp William. As the battle reached its climax, young William realized that the guardian was not simply a damned guardian, but a soul who had suffered for centuries. In those moments, the young man began to see visions of the guardian's past life, of the events that had led to his eternal curse. Understanding began to make him realize that only by freeing the guardian could he end the curse and the guardian's obsession with the cemetery. With bold determination, William confronted the guardian, who looked at him with shocked eyes. With an act of compassion and self-sacrifice, William touched the guardian's forehead and spoke the words of release. A blinding burst of light filled the cemetery as the guardian crumbled, letting out a cry of agony. The shadows and darkness that had surrounded the guardian were sucked into the abyss, and the cemetery returned to tranquility. But the twist was revealed in an even more sinister way. As William left the cemetery, he could sense an invisible presence attached to his soul, the remainder of the immortal guardian. It was as if the guardian had split into two. One part had been freed, while the other remained attached to William. He was now the keeper of the cemetery's hidden secrets, destined to wander for eternity among the graves. The young man carried the burden of the curse and forbidden knowledge, and as he walked away from the cemetery, he knew that the price of his act of mercy was an eternal bond with the dark guardian of the cemetery.